Using SASS, especially once we get into using front-end frameworks. I mostly used SASS. I didn't start using it really until Q3. So I think you guys are doing a great job, like wanting to use it already. There's no reason to be intimidated by SASS. It really just makes your life easier. I was sort of intimidated by it for a while, so I didn't bother. And then once I started using it, I was like, oh my God, this is great. Why haven't I been using this all along? But I used it with Ember. Ember is a front-end framework, kind of like Angular, React, etc. And Ember does a lot of, once you get it set up right, it kind of does a lot for you. So I actually, Ember essentially will do like the SASS compiling for you. We're going to set it up so that like we have SASS sort of installed on our local machine. The point I'm getting at is that I didn't actually have to like install SASS to get it to work. Or so the question of whether it makes sense to install it globally or locally, I don't know. Basically, that's up to you. The way that we're going to do it right now is just installing it. Like when you install it, you have access to the SASS command everywhere, but I think you need to set it up specifically to watch certain files like locally, essentially. So in any case, if you guys all open up your terminal, I'm going to work off of the CSS grids practice thing that I was doing yesterday, but in your folder, actually for this command it doesn't really matter if you're in your folder, type in gem install sass. Gem is a Ruby command. All Macs, modern Macs at least, come with Ruby pre-installed, and Ruby packages are called gems. So this is kind of similar to like doing npm install, stuff like that. It shouldn't take very long to install. Once you have it installed, the next command you want to run if you're getting errors, do sudo gem install sass. Sudo like overrides those permissions. It's kind of like a force command. Oh. Did that work? Yes. Okay, great. All right, everybody have it installed? Okay, sweet. So what we're going to do, I want to show you guys sort of a SASS like best practice, if you will. So Berto mentioned that one of the things that SASS is really useful for is it can help you split your CSS. If you have like one big file, you can split it into multiple files. You can also, everybody take a stretch, 5 seconds. Nice. Right now I just have one CSS file, and as you can see there aren't even really that many styles in it. If you're working on, like, you'll work on larger and larger projects as the course goes along, and you'll have more files to manage, and oftentimes you'll have a bunch of CSS files. One of the great features of SASS is that you can split, say, all of your styles for your headers into one page, into one file, and all your styles for your footer, and all your styles for small components if you're working on a large app. And then you can basically just import them all into one file and have SASS compile that into a CSS file and just link that one CSS file instead of having, say, in the head of your page, like 12 different CSS files. It's more efficient. It makes it so that when your page loads, the browser isn't making as many requests to load up all your files and load up all your CSS. I'm not talking like a huge performance difference, but it is more efficient. And it lets you, say Jay and I are working on a project together, I'm like, hey, I want to work on the CSS specifically for the header. Like I want to tweak that. Then I can work on that file safely while Jay's working on something else, and we're not creating as much of a risk of like merge conflicts with Git and GitHub. And it just makes your code more maintainable. You can imagine in a production environment where a company has an app that they've built 5 years ago and have added features upon features upon features to, their code base is probably pretty large. So the more modular you can make things in general, the better. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you guys the command to like create one SASS file and watch that file and compile that into a CSS file. But ultimately what we're going to do is we're going to set up a CSS folder and a SASS folder, and we're going to watch those folders. So any files that are in those folders will get compiled. So why don't everyone go ahead, actually don't touch. everyone make a directory called SASS or SCSS in your project folder. This is the folder that we're going to tell SASS to watch. If we just had you don't have to do this touch command. If we just had a SCSS, actually let's just call it style sass.scss. If you just had a SASS file, right now there's nothing in there, and you wanted to watch that file and compile that into one CSS file, you can do sass -- watch, and don't bother inputting this command right now because we're going to tell it to watch the folders. Sass -- watch sass.scss. So whatever the name of your file is, .scss, colon, and then the name of the file you want to compile it into. So let's just do css.css. So this is going to, now this is kind of like light server. So this is like a local process that's running on our computer that's like essentially constantly watching and checking for changes in that SCSS file. And it's going to I know this is kind of hard to see, but it's going to watch the sass.scss file, and any changes we make there, any sass that we write, it's going to compile it into the css.css file. And the reason it needs to do that is that browsers can only read CSS. Browsers can't actually read SASS. That's why SASS is called a preprocessor. So you can do a bunch of cool stuff in your .scss file with SASS, and then before your site is loaded, before your site is fully like processed, it turns that into a CSS file that you can actually link in your index.html and your site can actually use. So if, for example, we were to write like an H1 style, and let's just do like color orange. If we then check, actually we can see listening for and polling for changes, change detected to sass.scss, and then it wrote a change to the CSS file. So if we go back to our structure and we look at it, we see this H1 color orange. So in this example, we didn't do anything special with SASS, but that's just to show you that anything you do in that SASS file is automatically being compiled into the SCSS file, or to the CSS file.
I'm sorry, did you want us to?
No, don't bother.
Okay.
If you did, it's fine. Ultimately, what we're going to do, I'm going to have you guys make folders, and we'll watch the folders. For now, we might just put one file in them, but if we have time towards the end of this, I want to show you like how to split your file into multiple files, split your CSS into multiple files. So if you do have the watcher running, hit Control-C to exit it, and then instead of actually, you know what? Let's delete those files. So remove the SASS file and remove this CSS file. And instead of just doing it with single files, let's make two directories. Oh, did we already make the directories? Okay, so once you have the SCSS file, you can do, and everyone do this with me now, do sass -- watch SCSS : CSS. So this is saying instead of watch a particular file, watch this folder, and any changes in the SASS file in this folder, compile them into CSS files in this CSS folder.
Oh, so we should also have a CSS.
I believe if we make changes, maybe, yeah, we might also need the CSS folder. So yeah, make a CSS directory, and then run that watch command again. Let's see. I thought it automatically generated a SASS file for you. Looks like it doesn't.
Do I need to create another CSS file like on top of the one that I already been using?
You can leave the one you've already been using like intact for now, essentially. That's fine. Delete this.
So you made another CSS file?
This is just, so right now I just have my original CSS file, I have a .scss folder, and I have a CSS folder. Right now they're currently empty. So actually change directory into your SCSS file and touch, let's call it base.scss. .scss.
So, sorry, do we need another CSS folder then, or?
You need one, I know it's hard to see, one CSS folder and one SCSS folder. And if you change directory into the SCSS folder, here, I'm going to make this a little bigger. If you CD into the SCSS folder, you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call mine base.scss. And now if we run SASS --watch SCSS:CSS, so watch the SCSS folder, compile changes into the CSS folder. Oh. Have to change directory back up first. Sorry. Then you see SASS is watching for changes, write CSS/, so it's essentially watching that SASS file for changes, and it's created two files for us, base.css and base.css.map. Don't worry about the map file. You don't need to make any changes to that. That's essentially just like a bunch of information for SASS itself to use when, to point it to the right file to write when changes are made. So don't worry about that file. That's automatically generated. So now, does everyone have a folder, two folders, and have your terminal watching for changes?
Hold on. Yeah, I think so,
So you touch base CSS, SCSS.
Yep.
In your SCSS file.
Yes.
And I have another directory just CSS, but that's empty.
Yeah.
And I'm telling it outside of
And then CD back into like your main project directory,
and then do the
and then run this SASS --watch space.
in the SASS
Oh, it's
Good? Nice.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
When we, at the beginning, when we installed
SASS.
it was only for this project, so if we wanted.
I think that the gem install, I believe, makes it available anywhere. So you can use the SASS
in the
command.
future, we don't need to.
You won't need to run that command anymore. But you do need to like tell your machine to watch on like a project by project basis, essentially. And then once it's done watching, like if you're not making any more changes to your SCSS file, then you don't need to be watching anymore because the CSS file that it's going to compile into is complete, essentially. But if you were then to go back and you want to make changes, you would need to set the watcher up again. Okay, so everyone, we're on the same page here?
When I set up my,
That's okay.
my second directory, which is CSS, do I need to be in that when I'm watching for?
No, you want to actually be in like your base folder. So like I have, unfortunately I can't zoom in on my folder structure, but this project of mine is called Grid Practice. Within Grid Practice, I have my index HTML, etc. And then I have two folders on the same level, CSS and SCSS. And then to set the watcher up, you want to be in like the base directory of your project. So I'm in Grid Practice. Tell it to watch these two folders that are in this one. Yeah.
So if you have the watcher off and you make changes, it will not.
It won't compile them into the
Even if-
CSS.
Even if later, let me turn on the watcher.
Oh no, that is fine.
Is that gonna
It'll
transfer
recognize,
whatever?
yeah, if you make changes and then you turn the watcher on, it should recognize that you made changes and compile it. Yeah, I believe so. Well, you know what? We could try real quick. Actually, no, let's move on for now. Okay, so what I'm going to do for you guys is I'm going to do a quick refactor. So right now this site is just this right here. So I've got a header, I've got a footer, and I've got these boxes for the grids because we were playing around with grids yesterday. So the examples I'm going to show you are, it would be more valuable in a site that has more going on, that does more. If you were present for Ross's breakout or you want to watch it in retrospect, he's got a great example of how with just changing with a bunch of setup in SASS, you change them like a couple variables and you get like a whole new color scheme. But let's refactor this to SASS rather than CSS. So the first thing we can do, this is just from like my basic style.css file. It's not in one of the SCSS or CSS folders. You guys can just watch for this. You don't need to follow along. But I'm going to go into the base.scss file that I made, and I'm going to paste in the styles from my style.css file. Because ultimately what I want to do is I want to now link this base CSS file. And you see the watcher detected changes. So if we open up the folders and we go to base CSS, we see all these styles as well. And in fact, you see that it's organized them a little more cleanly. Just takes up a little bit less space than because I like to put my closing braces down here. So in the HTML file now, instead of pointing at my style.css file, I actually want to point to the base CSS file within this CSS folder. So if we change the source for my style sheet, I'll link it to /css/base.css because this is now where the styles are coming from. We should see no changes. Yeah, good. So our colors and whatnot are still applying. So the first thing I really want to talk about and try and show you guys the value of is variables. So we're using a couple different colors here. If we were using these colors more frequently, this would be a little more useful. But essentially what we can do, just kind of like you tend to declare variables towards the top of a function or towards the top of a script, we usually declare functions up at the top of a SASS, or sorry, variables up at the top of a SASS file. So in this case, I'm going to do a variable called primary color. You put this $sign in front of it to signify that this is a variable. Otherwise, it's just like doing var primary color equals in JS essentially, but this is the SASS way of doing it. So $sign primary color colon, and then whatever comes after this is a value that we're going to be able to use in our CSS file. So let's set a primary color of red, let's say. Now, let's say that I like materialized pink, but I actually want my header and my footer to be the same color and to be a different color, to be red, let's say. So if you were just writing CSS, you would essentially, you'd probably select the nav and you'd do background color red. That probably would work. Let's see. Yeah, that works. And then if you were going to do a style for the footer, do footer, basically the same thing. Background color red. I actually think this one needs important on it to override the materialized defaults. Great. So now we have the color that we were looking for. Our header and our footer are both red. But in terms of maintaining this code, or say in the future we decide we want this color to be blue for the nav and for the footer, the header and the footer, we would have to go into our CSS file and we'd have to find where the background color for nav is declared, and we'd have to find where the background color for footer is declared, and change it in both places. Now that's not that much of a pain when there's only two places, but you can imagine a scenario where you're using this same red color in 5 different places on your site, 10 different places on your site. And it'd be really nice if you could just change, oh, another quick stretch. If you could just change that, essentially change that color value in one place and have it apply everywhere on your site. So this is where variables come in. Since we have primary color set to red, instead of doing background color red for the nav, we can do primary, set nav to primary color. And we can do the same thing for the footer. So this is like, all we're doing here is passing in the value of primary color, which in this case is red. It could be a hex value, it could be an RGB value. any valid CSS value can be stored in a variable like this. Now, if we go back to the site, it's the same, but if we wanted to change the header and the footer color to blue, let's say, all we have to do is change the value of primary color, and boom, we get our header and our footer both change colors. So you can imagine a scenario where you want to change the header and the footer and maybe the title of a bunch of cards that you're using on the page, and you've got some accent colors in there. And rather than having to sift through all of your CSS to like sort of change up your color scheme, if you want to, even if you want to just like play around and try stuff out, maybe I don't like that blue that much, and I'd rather go with like a gray. Yeah, it's a little more subtle. Yeah, let's go with that. So especially if you're like testing stuff out, you want to be more flexible, you can save yourself so much time by using these variables. And you can use them for way more than just color. Color is just a typical sort of use case. So in the same vein, we can do like secondary color. And I don't know, what color should we do? Green? What? Orange. Let's do orange. So now we have this secondary color variable, and let's replace these orange boxes with the secondary colors. So it looks like those are our third box. We can do secondary color here.
Already orange.
It is. It's not going to change anything. But now if we wanted to like make all these boxes the same color, we could, or we wanted, say, the first and the third boxes to be the secondary color. Oh, there we go. And the second one to be the primary color. We can just pass in these variables. And now our site is a lot more dynamic, because all we have to do if we want to change the way these colors are laid out is change variables in one or two places, and it's going to apply everywhere. Does that make sense? So you can also, like, you can store essentially any valid CSS value in these. So if you say you're doing like some sizings, and you like for margins, you want your margins to be like generally like 1 EM. I think for the nav, let's see. Do I have a margin here anywhere? Doesn't look like it. Let's say we wanted like a margin bottom on the nav. We could do margin bottom and set that to margin. I might need to make this important for it to apply. So now that's been moved down. Or if you had margins applied like in a bunch of different places on your site, like let's say we want another margin, the top of the footer. So we could do like margin top. We could just do 1 EM or 2 EMs or whatever, but if we use the variable value and we do margin here, then if we want to play around, does that need an important as well? Yeah, it doesn't want to do it, does it? In any case, now if we want to change our margins for some reason to 3, it did work. Now if we want to change those margins between our header and our footer, we can just change one value. So essentially the more, you don't necessarily need to go overboard and like store all of your styles and variables, but it's kind of like the dry principle. Don't repeat yourself. If you find yourself writing the same styles over and over again, you can store, especially if you want to be able to change that, like essentially at the drop of the hat, and see how that might affect the whole layout of your site. Use variables and store, stash values in there, and then all you have to do is change that one variable, and you can change a lot of stuff on your site. So you can do margins, you can do colors, you can do sizes in general. You can really do, like I said, any valid CSS value can be stored in a variable. A lot of people will do, when they're creating like a color scheme, they'll have a primary color, a secondary color, an accent color, and maybe one more color. And then you apply that using variables in all these different places on your site, And then you can quickly change up or tweak the color scheme by just changing those values. You don't even have to sift through your CSS at all to be like super flexible and have your code be super maintainable. And then if we check over to the base CSS file, you'll see that this is with the watcher on. This is just compiling our SASS into just regular CSS. So the variables are gone from the top, and it's essentially just piping in the values. So for like the margin, just 2 EM in each spot. So it like SASS just turns into regular CSS, and that's what you link into your actual file, your actual product. Any questions?
Well, yeah, actually.
Yeah.
How does this link to your page when you're not watching it? Does it automatically save it?
Yeah. So, well, it won't automatically, if you make changes to the SASS file, it won't automatically like save it in terms of compiling it into this CSS. But ultimately, all you're linking in your project, like all I'm linking here is the base.css file. So as long as you're watching when you make changes to your SASS file, it'll compile it into CSS, and that's what your app is actually using. So when you say, like when you deploy, you're just deploying, all you really need to deploy is the CSS file. Because ultimately all the browser can read is HTML, JavaScript, and CSS.
So SASS is just kind of taking all that and pushing it into the base.
Yeah.
I can read it easily.
Yeah, SASS is essentially giving us this extra functionality of the variables, of writing nested styles, of mix-ins, functions, like a lot of other stuff. But all it really does ultimately is give you extra functionality and then translate that or compile that into CSS.
So you have a base CSS file and a base SCSS?
Yeah, so when we set the watcher up, I created a base SCSS file, and in an SCSS folder, I created a CSS folder with nothing in it. And then when you tell the watcher to watch the SCSS file, it automatically creates a CSS file of the same name, creates this map file, and just starts translating your SASS that you've written into CSS. Yeah. So the watcher does a lot for you. You just need to make the two folders and create a SASS file, a .scss file in your SCSS folder. You can call it whatever you want. I just called it base.
Where's that link in the HTML?
Yeah. So all I'm doing here is I'm going into the CSS folder, and I'm linking my base CSS file. Because ultimately that's where all of the relevant styling code is going to end up. Roxy.
So were you just now working in your base CSS or your base SCSS?
I was working in my base SCSS.
Oh,
That's what lets you, so all you have to do is work in the SCSS file, and it automatically converts it into CSS and puts it into that base CSS file.
So you have to have the watcher running for it to push it.
Yeah.
You can't be messing around in your terminal in other areas.
Yeah, so it's a good thing to do is if you have a tab open and you start running the watcher, if you control click on the tab, you can do duplicate tab and it'll open another tab in the exact location that you're in. So if you need to do Git stuff, usually I'll have one tab open running a watcher or running light server or both in this case, and then another tab that's like for Git. I don't have this folder initialized as a Git repo. But yeah, anytime you're running like a watcher or a server, like a process that sort of takes over the terminal, it's best to open up another tab so that you can do your Git stuff, create any files you need to create, and not have to close your watcher or your server down, because that just usually leads to, all right, we'll skip this one. That usually leads to forgetting to turn it back on, which isn't the end of the world, but again, we're always trying to save time. So another thing I want to show you guys is nested styles. So this is in this example, this might not be the most powerful tool, but this is a great way to organize your code in general and make it easier to write. Make it easier to write CSS essentially. So you see we have, let's just do this one. We have our main with the class container, and we have this div with the class of row and books in here. We also have a div with the class row. And then within there, we have some divs, first, second, third, essentially just these divs that are creating the page. Normally, you could just select these things with classes. You could just select them with IDs if they had IDs. But sometimes you might be, say, working with a list. So you have a div that's holding an unordered list that has list items in it. And to access those, you kind of have to write out like maybe the name of the div class and then UL, LI, and you have to get specific, especially as you guys have learned with like Materialize or Bootstrap. Sometimes you have to get very specific in the way you're selecting things for your styles to work. SASS provides awesome functionality for selecting things. Let's actually look at the nav. So in the nav, we have a div, and then there's an A tag in the div. So if we wanted to apply a style to the nav wrapper div, one way we could do that with SASS is we could do, or with CSS, we could do like nav, what was the class of the div? Nav wrapper. We could do like nav, div class, nav wrapper, and then A. So we have to kind of like write all that out if we want to use sort of DOM traversal to select things. An awesome thing that SASS does for us is it lets us nest styles within other like elements that we're using for styling. So you can actually write styles within the brackets for nav for the div that's in there. So if we do div, I don't know if this div has any like actual properties we can mess with, but let's try and give it a border. Oh yeah, so we have a border here now. I don't know if you guys can see that. Yeah. So normally if you just wrote div border 2 pixels solid black, we would probably get a bunch of borders in places we're not necessarily expecting. Yeah, look at all that. Like that's obviously a mess because we've got divs all over this page. But using SASS, when we write this inside of the nav rule, this is essentially saying only apply this rule for divs that are nested inside of the nav. In this case, we only have one div inside of the nav, so it only applies a border to that, which is what you see around the header, essentially. We also didn't have to, what happened to my code? Oh, that's weird. We also didn't have to write any actual, we didn't have to write as much code as we would have to select that so specifically. And we didn't have to attach an ID to it. We didn't have to do any like sort of workaround stuff. If you check out the CSS file though, you'll see that we have nav and then we have nav div. So these styles aren't actually nested within each other. You can see this closing brace finishes off the nav styling, but SASS has gone ahead and made our lives easier. All we had to do was declare that div style within our nav, and SASS took care of the rest and compiled it into valid CSS. Now if we wanted to select that A tag within there, we could just do A within the div and apply another style for that. Let's try background color green. Yeah, obviously not very pretty, but very functional SASS. So this nested styling helps you write less code, but it also makes it a lot clearer what you're doing. You're saying, all right, we've got a nav out, just like properly like nested and indented HTML, when it's done right, makes it a lot easier to read and understand what's going on. The same thing, and JavaScript for that matter, the same thing's happening here. It's very easy for someone to look at this code and say, oh, we're in the nav, now we're in a div in the nav, now we're in an A within that div. So it kind of keeps your CSS more organized and easier to read for yourself if you're coming back to look at an old project and trying to understand what you're doing, but especially for other people. If you're working on a team, this is very, very clear, because if we were going to write these styles just in CSS, like these could be anywhere. You could have the style for the nav up here. You could have nav div down at the bottom. Now that wouldn't be a great way to organize your code, but it's perfectly valid. Doing it like this with SASS makes it like really, really clear that here's some nav styles, here's some nav styles, and here's all the other styles that relate to elements within that nav. Does that make sense? Cool. Those are the two like big features, if you will, that I wanted to talk about. SASS does a lot more for you. I think these are some of the things that are really like easy to implement ultimately. They make your life easier, they make your code more readable, and more maintainable. So this is as deep as I want to go on SASS features for right now. I do want to show you real quick how to split your files into multiple SASS files. So essentially what we're going to do for this is we're going to create some more files in that SASS folder, and SASS is going to essentially combine them all into one. So we'll split some of the styles from this example out. I'm going to change directory into the SCSS folder, and I'm going to touch a couple files. So this is using what are called partials. In the SASS documentation, under like the basics, you can go to partials. And so partials are essentially part of your overall CSS file. And to make a partial file, blow that up so you guys can read it. To make a partial file, you essentially just put an underscore before the name of the file. So right now, I'm going to touch a header, underscore header.scss, a underscore main.scss, and an underscore footer.scss. So since this is like a smaller project, I'm just going to split the header styles into one place, the styles for the main content into another, and styles for the footer into another. So now you can see that we've got these underscore files, but even though we've made changes, essentially, we don't have like more CSS files. If you had multiple SASS files without underscores in here, it would watch and it would compile them into their equivalent .css files. We don't actually want that right now, because what we're going to do with base is essentially just import the styles from these three other files. So actually, yeah, let's do it like this. So let's split, especially because we have them nested now, let's split the variable declarations and the nav styles into header. Actually, let's just copy it for right now. So we split that out there. So here's all our header styles. If someone ever wants to play around with those and tweak them, they can do that. We have our main styles. So let's do column, first, second, third, nested. Let's split those into their own file. Copy those. Put them in main. Save it. And then let's put those footer styles in footer.scss. Now, in base, instead of having all these actual styles written here, I'm going to go ahead and delete those. And the way to bring these files in is with @import, and then in quotes the name of the file that you want to import. So we'll do header. Let's do @import. Actually, I think you have to, yeah, close it out with a semicolon. I like to do the imports like very explicitly. You can also, I believe, put commas and just do it like sort of in one line. For the sake of being really clear right now, I'm going to do them on separate lines. So, and you don't have to put the .scss. Since you're doing an import statement, SASS like essentially is smart enough to know what you're telling it to do, and it it looks for a file with .scss. And what do we have? Import footer, right? So now, when we go back to our site, we broke it. Oh, yeah. Now when we go to our site, we see the same thing. The reason why we see the same thing is we haven't actually changed anything in terms of like different styles. We've just made our code super modular. And if you go to, you'll see there are no extra files in the CSS. We still just have base CSS, but base CSS is still composed properly. So we've had these changes made. The watcher was taken care of recompiling into the CSS file. And now we have really modular code. It's actually a fairly common practice if you're doing a lot of variables or mix-ins. Mix-ins let you like kind of write like full snippets of a bunch of styles and reuse them. If you're using sort of all the SASS features, it's actually fairly common practice to break those into their own file. So we could do, in addition to these partials, we could do variables .scss and split those into their own file. Take them out of the header, which kind of makes sense to have them in their own spot. Put them in variables. And then in our base, make sure to import those first because the rest of our files are relying on those. So now, like if I save, the CSS file is still intact. But if you weren't compiling your CSS file without
Save your header.
without the variables, oh yeah, nice. Yeah. So now everything is busted. Thanks, Jay. Now everything's busted because we're trying to set styles with variables that don't exist. So we do have the variables and variables. Now if we import them properly, we'll be fine. So keep in mind when you're doing these imports, whether you're doing them comma separated or you're doing them sort of like I've done here, part of the reason I like to do it on each on a line is that kind of reminds you that this is still CSS. So this is still, the cascade is still intact here. So you need to respect the cascade. If you have your variables in the middle or at the end and you're importing a file before then that's trying to use them, it's not going to be able to do so. So when you make your files modular like this, just keep in mind that ultimately it is just creating one CSS file from it, so the cascade matters. If we save that and we go back, our site's back intact. Awesome. Any questions? Yeah, Jay.
Wait, so as far as like the color set, or like the variables,
Yeah.
is there a way to make them like more dynamic just based off of like the primary color?
Yeah, there are some built-in color functions. Let's see if they have that
That's
here.
kind of what I was looking into at the time.
Yeah,
So
they
there's a way to like, isn't there a way to kind of like have it so that you can pick
Yeah,
the
you
primary
can-
color, make
you
the
can,
purple page set, and then everything broken up into like whether it's the opposite, like a complementary.
Yeah, there's darken, lighten, complement. There's at least a few others. Let's see. Colors. Let's see. Color operations. This isn't really what we're looking for. Do a quick search. But yeah, you can work off of that like a base color, and you can create essentially like a whole color scheme from that. If you have like darken and lighten, so the first variable, let's just do, if you want to, we can do a quick example
I
with
just want to
those.
see how
Yeah, so we have like primary color. Let's do primary light, and that equals, I think it's just lighten, and then I think you pass in like a percentage, and then you pass in the color you want to lighten. could have the order wrong here. Let's see if we can use this variable. So if we go to our header, let's say instead of the primary color, let's do primary lighten. Nope. I think I have the order of these mixed up. Oops. Oh, I did. I put lighten, didn't I? Oh, that might have been the problem. Let's change that. Primary light. Oh yeah, it's gray, so it's kind of hard to tell. Let's change the primary. Let's do something obvious like blue. So yeah, it's only 15%, but let's change it so it's a little more clear. Let's do like 30%. So yeah, so this in this case, SASS does like a bunch of calculation for you, and it just takes like the hex value or the color value for your primary color, and it just lightens it by whatever percentage you specify. Darken does a similar thing, so you could do primary dark. Oh, forgot the $sign. Primary dark equals, we'll just copy this. But if you change this to darken, it should darken by 30%. Now let's set something to that. Maybe in the main, let's set this instead of primary color. Let's set this to primary dark. Yeah. So now we have our primary color darkened. And let's do a complementary color now. Let's switch these two because it'll look cooler. Yeah, so back to variables. So we can just call this one complement. And it's complement. It's a very similar syntax, except you don't pass, I believe you don't pass a second operator to that, second argument. So this like gives you the exact opposite color on like the color wheel. The base. Oh, it's because I don't have a color in here. Yeah, so let's pass in complement. Thanks, Mary. Yeah. So now we have like essentially like a website that looks like it's for the University of Michigan. So now that we have all these set up, and there are more, I would say look into that. There are more built-in like color functions. So now if we change, God, that green looks terrible. Where is that coming from? Whatever. Now if we go back to our variables and we change this primary color to red, we go back here, our whole site has changed, like our whole color scheme. We may not like how it looks, but you can play with the percentages. Let's see, does complement take a percentage also? Let's do like 20%. Nope. All right, so yeah, no percentages on that one.
You can take that and you can just log on target and put a percentage.
Yes. So yeah, so that's the other thing is like you can then apply these functions to your secondary color. You can apply them to the light. So if you like sort of wire things up like this using a bunch of the color functions, a bunch of like manipulations that are dependent on other variables, then you can really have like a whole color scheme change by just changing one variable. Let's see what happens if we do like yellow. So it can give you a lot of power to play around with stuff, and I think this stuff with the variables is like the most easy to approach and the easiest to implement. I highly encourage you guys to check it out, even if you don't do it for this project. SASS is just, and especially if you're interested in front end, and you think you might be going for a career in front end development. I think there are probably very few good front end jobs that you wouldn't be using SASS in. So if you feel an inclination towards specializing in that direction, check out SASS. It's very cool. Any last questions? Ty?
You please post a video.
Yeah, definitely. The recording actually worked, so we're in business.
And then
And I'll post Ross's video too. Ross goes into some cool stuff that I didn't touch on here. All right, thanks guys.